My beloved child, he returned to the house he left behind, but he did not return as the same person who once walked away. Something inside him had shifted, something he could no longer ignore, and the moment he stood outside that familiar place again, memories came rushing toward him with a force he never expected. He remembered the conversations he once dismissed, the moments he pretended did not matter, the way your presence made that house feel different from every other place he had ever known. And what makes this story so powerful is that he did not come back simply because he missed the past. He came back because somewhere along the way, he finally understood what he had actually left behind. You. The connection. The emotional safety. The person who knew parts of him he had never learned how to explain. He had convinced himself that walking away would make everything easier, that distance would quiet the feelings, that enough time would erase the memories. But time did something completely different. It made the memories clearer. It made the silence louder. It made him realize that there are some connections you can step away from physically without ever truly leaving emotionally. And when he finally returned to that house, he was not looking at walls, rooms, doors, or windows. He was looking at a chapter of his life that suddenly felt unfinished. There was one particular memory that stopped him completely, and this is where the story takes a turn you may not expect. Because that memory was connected to something you once said to him, something he probably acted like he did not care about at the time. Yet now, standing there again, those words were the first thing that came back to him. He remembered your voice. He remembered your expression. He remembered what you were trying to tell him beneath the words. And for the first time, he wondered whether he had misunderstood you all along. But here is what makes his return so much more meaningful: he did not immediately rush toward you. He stood there with hesitation because he knew that returning physically was easier than returning emotionally. He knew that if he reached for you again, he could not pretend everything was exactly as it had been before. Too much had happened inside his heart. Too many questions had remained unanswered. He had spent time trying to convince himself that he could build a completely different life without thinking about you, yet certain moments kept bringing you back into his thoughts without permission. A song. A familiar place. A quiet evening. A random memory that appeared when he least expected it. And each time, he pushed it away. But eventually, pushing the feeling away became harder than admitting it existed. That is why his return carries a different energy. He is not simply revisiting a location. He is revisiting the version of himself that existed when you were close to him. The version that laughed more freely. The version that felt understood without having to explain every emotion. The version that knew there was someone who could see beyond his surface. And perhaps the most surprising part is that he now understands something he could not understand before. Sometimes a person leaves because they are confused, not because they do not care. Sometimes they create distance because closeness forces them to confront emotions they are not prepared to face. He may have believed that leaving would give him clarity, but the distance became the very thing that revealed the truth. The farther he moved from you, the more clearly he recognized what your presence had meant. And now, standing at the house he once left behind, he was forced to face a question he had avoided for far too long. If you meant so little, then why did coming back feel like coming home? There is another detail you need to understand, because this is where his feelings become even harder to hide. He remembers the little things. Not just the dramatic moments, not just the conversations that changed everything, but the tiny details you probably assumed he had forgotten. The way you reacted when you were genuinely happy. The expression on your face when you were trying not to show that something had hurt you. The small habits you had. The way you could make an ordinary moment feel important without even trying. He remembers more than he ever admitted. And perhaps you thought that because he became distant, he had erased those memories. But distance does not always mean forgetting. Sometimes distance gives memories room to grow. He began comparing new experiences with the ones he had shared with you, and slowly, he noticed something that unsettled him. Certain things simply did not feel the same. He could meet people, talk to people, laugh with people, and continue living his life, but the emotional familiarity he experienced with you was difficult to replace. That realization did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, through hundreds of small moments. And then one day, something happened that made him stop pretending. He found himself thinking about what your life might look like now. He wondered whether you still remembered him. Whether you ever thought about what happened between you. Whether you had finally moved forward. And one question became impossible to silence. What if you no longer had a place for him in your heart? That question frightened him, not because he expected you to wait forever, but because he finally understood that his hesitation had consequences. He had once assumed that the door would always remain open simply because the connection had once been strong. Now he realizes that hearts do not stay frozen in one moment forever. People grow. People change. People learn to protect their peace. And suddenly, returning was no longer about whether he wanted you. It was about whether he still had the courage to approach you honestly. And this is the part you were never supposed to see coming. He did not return because everything had become easy. He returned because something inside him had finally become clear. There is a difference. Easy would have been staying away, keeping the past where it belonged, and continuing forward without looking back. But clarity made him turn around. Clarity made him remember. Clarity made him wonder what could have happened if he had been more honest, more emotionally present, more willing to recognize what was happening between you. He now understands that what he left behind was not simply a house or a place connected to old memories. He left behind an emotional chapter that never received its proper ending. And somewhere deep inside, he knows that if he gets another opportunity to speak to you, he cannot waste it by repeating the same patterns. He cannot return with half-truths and uncertainty. He cannot expect you to simply forget the distance and act as if nothing happened. If he comes back into your life, he knows there must be a reason, a conversation, a truth that finally gets spoken aloud. And perhaps that is why this moment feels so intense. Because before he ever reaches you, he has already reached a decision within himself. He has finally stopped asking, "Can I live without this connection?" and started asking, "What would I have to become to deserve another chance?" That question changes everything. Because the person who once walked away was trying to escape what he felt. The person standing at that house now is trying to understand it. And he may not know exactly what will happen next, but one thing has become impossible for him to deny: leaving you behind did not make you less important. It made him realize just how deeply you had already become part of his story. Something changed the moment he stepped through that familiar doorway, because the house did not feel empty anymore. It felt like every forgotten memory had been waiting for him to finally understand what it meant. He walked through the rooms slowly, almost as if he was afraid that moving too quickly would make the memories disappear. And then he noticed something he had never noticed before. A small detail connected to a moment you shared. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. He remembered the way you once looked at him when you wanted him to understand something without having to say it directly. At the time, he misunderstood that look. He thought you were asking too much from him. Now he realizes you were simply asking him to be honest. That realization stayed with him as he moved through the house. Every familiar corner seemed to bring back another piece of the connection he had tried to put away. And somewhere between those memories, he realized the truth he had been avoiding: he never really stopped talking to you in his mind. There were conversations he imagined having with you after he left. Things he wished he had said differently. Questions he wished he had answered. Even apologies he never found the courage to express. He had replayed certain moments so many times that he knew exactly where he should have paused, where he should have listened, where he should have stopped protecting his pride and simply told you what was happening inside him. But the strangest part was that every imagined conversation eventually returned to the same point: you were still the person he wanted to explain himself to. Not a stranger from the past. Not merely a memory. You. Then came the moment that made his return feel completely different. He found himself standing in a room where something about you seemed almost present, not literally, but emotionally. It reminded him of how deeply your connection had affected that place. He thought changing his surroundings would change his feelings. It did not. He thought meeting new people would erase the emotional imprint you had left behind. It did not. He thought enough silence would eventually make the connection feel insignificant. Instead, silence made him recognize how much he missed being understood. And now he is beginning to see that perhaps the hardest thing about losing someone is not losing their presence. It is losing the version of yourself that existed around them. Around you, he could be vulnerable without feeling weak. He could speak without carefully measuring every word. He could sit in silence without feeling like he had to perform. That kind of connection is rare, and he knows it now because he has experienced what life feels like without it. This is why his return should not be viewed as a simple change of location. It represents an internal shift. He is revisiting the place because the place holds evidence of a chapter he never emotionally closed. And while he was there, one thought kept returning: if he had known then what he knows now, would he have still walked away? The answer became painfully clear. No. He would have stayed longer. He would have listened more carefully. He would have told you what he felt instead of assuming you somehow already knew. And now, my beloved child, there is something even deeper happening inside him. He has begun wondering whether you would recognize the person he has become. Because he knows that simply returning is not enough. He knows you may have changed too. Maybe you no longer respond to the same things. Maybe you no longer chase explanations. Maybe you have learned to protect your heart by choosing peace over uncertainty. That possibility has forced him to think differently about you. Before, he may have assumed that your feelings would remain exactly where he left them. Now he understands that you were never standing still. While he was away trying to understand his own emotions, you were living your life. You were growing. You were becoming stronger. And that realization has created a strange mixture of admiration and regret inside him. He admires the possibility that you may have learned to live without him, but he regrets that his absence may have taught you how to stop expecting him. That is the part he cannot easily accept. Because somewhere inside, he still remembers the version of you who believed there was something worth protecting between you. And now he wonders whether that version of you still exists. This is why his next move matters so much. He cannot simply appear and expect everything to return to normal. He must approach you differently. He must acknowledge what happened. He must understand that trust is not restored through one emotional conversation. It is rebuilt through consistency. And for perhaps the first time, he is thinking beyond the moment. He is thinking about what it would actually take to become someone you could believe again. But there is one final realization waiting for him, and this is the part that changes the entire meaning of his return. He finally understands that the house was never the real place he was trying to return to. You were. The house simply carried the memories. The rooms carried the echoes. The doorway represented the moment he chose to leave. But the emotional destination was always the connection he shared with you. And when he stood there again, he realized that what he missed was not merely the past. He missed the possibility of a future that he once walked away from before he fully understood its value. That thought stayed with him long after he left the house. He began imagining what it would be like to see you again, not with the confidence he once had, but with a humility he had never shown before. He wondered what your first reaction would be. Would you smile? Would you remain quiet? Would you ask why he came back? And if you asked that question, he knew there was no longer any room for an easy answer. He would have to tell you the truth. He would have to admit that distance did not erase the connection. It revealed it. He would have to admit that the person he thought he could forget became the person he kept remembering. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: he is no longer afraid of admitting that he cares. He is afraid that he waited too long to show it. That fear is what follows him now. Not fear of the past, but the possibility that the future may require him to finally be brave enough to knock on a door he once chose to walk away from. The next morning, he woke up with one thought that refused to leave him: what if you were no longer waiting for an explanation? He had expected returning to the house to bring closure, but instead it opened something inside him that he had spent a long time keeping quiet. He remembered the exact feeling of leaving, the certainty he once carried that distance would make everything simpler. Yet now, looking back, he could see how incomplete that decision had been. He had mistaken temporary relief for real peace. He had believed that if he stopped seeing you, stopped hearing your voice, and stopped revisiting those memories, the connection would eventually become less important. Instead, the opposite happened. The silence gave every unresolved feeling more room to speak. And now, one particular thought kept returning: you deserved to know what was really happening inside him back then. Not an excuse. Not a dramatic explanation. The truth. He was not ready. He was overwhelmed by the depth of what he felt, and rather than admitting that vulnerability, he chose distance. He convinced himself that walking away was strength when, in reality, it was avoidance. He now understands that some people do not leave because they feel nothing. Sometimes they leave because feeling something real forces them to confront parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. You made him see himself differently. You made him question what he wanted, what he feared, and what kind of relationship he was actually capable of building. That was uncomfortable for him. So he stepped away. But now he has returned to the emotional truth he once tried to escape, and it has a name: you. What he discovered after returning was even more unexpected. He began noticing how often your memory appeared in ordinary parts of his day. It was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was something as simple as seeing a familiar place or hearing a phrase that reminded him of you. Sometimes it was an ordinary moment when he suddenly wished he could tell you something. That is how he realized the connection had not disappeared, it had simply become quieter. And quiet feelings can sometimes be the strongest because they survive without constant attention. He started wondering whether you experienced anything similar. Did certain memories still surprise you? Did you ever wonder why things ended the way they did? Did you ever imagine what might have happened if he had made different choices? He could not know the answers, and that uncertainty was beginning to change him. Before, he had been comfortable assuming what you felt. Now, he understands that he has no right to assume. If he wants another opportunity, he has to approach you with honesty rather than expectation. He has to accept that you may have moved forward. He has to respect whatever boundaries you created while he was away. And strangely, that realization made his feelings stronger rather than weaker. Because for the first time, he was not thinking only about what he wanted from you. He was thinking about what you deserved from him. You deserved clarity. You deserved consistency. You deserved someone who did not disappear whenever emotions became complicated. And the more he thought about that, the more he realized that his return could not simply be about getting you back. It had to be about becoming someone who could finally meet you where you were. Then something happened that he did not expect at all. He began remembering the last time he saw you before everything changed. At the time, he focused on what was being said. Now he remembers what was not being said. The hesitation. The unfinished sentence. The look that lasted just a little longer than normal. The feeling that both of you knew there was more beneath the surface but neither of you had enough courage to bring it into the open. He remembers leaving with words still trapped inside him. And that memory now feels completely different. Because he understands that sometimes the most painful part of a separation is not the goodbye itself. It is knowing that the real conversation never happened. He wonders what you would have said if he had stayed. He wonders what you might have admitted if he had simply stopped trying to control the outcome. He wonders whether one honest conversation could have changed the direction of everything. These questions are not allowing him to remain comfortable anymore. They are pushing him towards something he once avoided: communication. And this is where his return becomes more than nostalgia. Nostalgia wants to relive the past. His heart is beginning to ask whether the past can teach him how to build something better. He does not want to recreate the same relationship exactly as it was. He wants to understand what went wrong and what would need to change. He wants to know whether the connection still has a future, but he also knows that he cannot demand an answer from you. He can only show up honestly and allow you to decide what happens next. And now comes the realization that he has been moving toward all along. He finally understands why the house affected him so deeply. It was not because every room contained a memory of you. It was because every memory reminded him of a version of himself who had once believed he had unlimited time. He thought there would always be another conversation. Another opportunity. Another chance to explain. Another moment to say what he really felt. But life does not guarantee those moments. That is what Chang